Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Horror Analysis with me, Drew. Today, we're continuing with Section E, Non-Narrative Horror, which of course is tough because most of the stuff that I've been talking about, even though it's not your traditional narratives, stories or movies or whatnot, are pretty much narrative or illustrations of narrative in the last section. Today, we're going over horror poetry. And most, if not all, all are going to be narrative poems. Narrative poetry from my year of teaching, I remember this. Narrative poetry being one of the big chunks of poetry. A poem that tells a story. Contrast that with lyric poetry, which just sort of expresses an idea or imagery in a lyrical way. Or prose poetry, which is even weirder. I double-checked with Wikipedia today about my poetry stuff. And yeah, prose poetry and micro stories are, they're sometimes indistinguishable. But there is a cool section that I didn't actually make a slide about. Stop clicking your pen, Drew. I'll do a non-clicky pen to spin around in my hand. There's a cool Wikipedia article on speculative poetry, which is essentially sci-fi, horror, or fantasy poetry, the speculative genre, in poetic forms, and which reminded me of a lot of other people that I probably should be talking about today, but am not. Like Neil Gaiman's poetry, which is good stuff. It actually reminded me of Christina Rossetti, and I'll hopefully remember her when I talk about the people I planned on talking about earlier. This is the list I have. Horror poetry. In chronological order, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Edgar Allan Poe, Robert Browning, Fitzjames O'Brien, and Howard Phillips Lovecraft. That's Goethe. That's Coleridge. That's Poe. That's Browning. That's Fitzjames O'Brien. And that's Lovecraft. None of these guys are doing non-narrative horror. All of the ones that, with the exception of some stuff by Poe, and maybe Childe Roland, but that's definitely a narrative, but it's got lyrical qualities to it. Poe, a lot of these guys walk the line between, narrative and lyrical. Yeah. We'll go over them. First is Goethe. Goethe, what is his dates? 1749 to 1832. Goethe is a big name in literature in general. The Sorrows of Young Werther, Faust, which we've talked about before, which is actually quasi-horror or horror. His Faust is probably the most famous, with maybe Dr. Faustus by Marlowe being close second. But his he has a great poem. He's known for his poetry as well. And one of his poems is Der Erlkönig, the Earl King, which we'll actually re-explore again when we go into music next time, because it was put to music by somebody or other. Maybe it's on my notes. Der Erlkönig, which is in that part of my notes. I have it written down, but I don't have the composer. The Jesse Norman version. But anyway, the Erlkönig is the Earl King, the king of the fairies, but a dark fairy type, horrific fairy type thing, who essentially just steals a kid from his father. Like, riding along on the trail, riding along through the forest in a cart. The son and father, the son says, the Earl King's calling me, Daddy. Oh no, son, that's just the wind. Guess what, Daddy? It wasn't just the wind. It's a, that sort of thing, and it keeps going on, stanza after stanza, and the Earl King's coming for the kid. Dad's not paying attention. Said, just calm down, son. We're going to be home soon. One of you is. Horror. That counts as horror and in poetic form, but it's not non-narrative by any stretch of the imagination because it's telling a story. He is the earliest one on our list. Goethe, 1749 to 1832. He lasted a little bit longer than most of these guys. He was, what was it, 83? Or 82 when he died? That's quite a long life for a poet. Compared to Poe, or, well, I guess, or Lovecraft even, or Fitzjames O'Brien, but he had a war on his side to shorten his life. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, 1772 to 1834. 62? My math's correct. Coleridge actually had a couple of, horrific or quasi-horrific poems. Christabel being chief among them. Christabel was what was read at a party when four English people decided to make a story writing contest, out of which came Polidori's The Vampire and Shelley's Frankenstein. And of course Byron and Percy Shelley also wrote little bits. Byron, of course, had a falling out with Polidori because Polidori ripped him off, ripped off his story, and got famous for The Vampire. That was very similar to Lord Byron's The Burial. Christabel is a story. It's a poem, but it's a story of a woman who goes out riding and sees a woman who's lost and brings her back to the castle and, brings her into her house and her bedroom, not in a sexual way, not in an overtly sexual way. Christabel's one of those things where, is this a lesbian story? Like, are the, characters in, what's the word? In masking language sort of thing. Is this a story about, lesbians? But, Anyway, the father says he's going to bring the found girl back to her father, who apparently was that they had a fight, and he's using it as an excuse to make amends with the father. But the found girl is slowly draining the life away from the innocent girl that found her. And it's an unfinished poem as well, so we don't actually know how it ends. But anybody can see how it ends. This one is has lyrical elements. It's obviously a narrative poem, but it's more of a lyrical, dreamy style. Trying to get the emotion of things more so. Actually, I think all of these are available on LibriVox.org. I've told you about LibriVox many, many times. Free audiobook site where you can listen to an audiobook without having to pay for an audiobook because it's public domain and the readers are amateur readers who are doing it just to do it for public domain. And that doesn't mean that if they're amateur readers, it doesn't mean they're bad. I can imagine that most of these guys are like using LibriVox as their on their resume or their to get their foot in the door of either reading or acting or something along those lines, because a lot of them are very good. So besides Christabel, also Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Probably Coleridge's most famous, besides Xanadu, and I'll talk about Xanadu in a second, or Kubla Khan. So, Rime of the Ancient Mariner is the story of the guy who goes to sea, shoots the albatross, has to wear the albatross around his neck. The whole ship dies. Then the ghost ship comes up, and he meets with this stuff, and it's a big... I won't go into the details and the imagery and the symbolism and stuff because I barely understand it, but it's there. There's lots of symbolism and stuff. But the ghost ship stuff with just the ribs of ship populated by skeletons is horrific, and it's good. And then no, I won't spoil the ending. Try not to. Spoiled the middle. But it's a good story. Well, it's not spoiling the ending because whatever. It's worth listening to or reading. It's worth reading, and if you don't want to read it, it's worth listening to on LibriVox. Actually, I found a lot of these on YouTube as well, where it's just a guy reading it, usually with a screen, of some scary thing, that maybe is his guy's face. Coleridge or whatever. I've listened to The Fungi of Yuggoth from Lovecraft on YouTube. But Coleridge you can find on LibriVox, or you can find on YouTube as well. Rime of the Ancient Mariner and Christabel are kind of long. I think Christabel took me about an hour to listen to, and Rime I read in about an hour as well. There is Xanadu, which I listened to within about less than 3 minutes, or about 3 minutes earlier today. Kubla Khan. The name of the poem is called Kubla Khan. The one that famously opens in Xanadu to Kubla Khan, a stately pleasure dome decree, etc. This is when I'm almost positive this is a direct result of Coleridge being on wrong one, sorry. That's the one. Opium, yeah. I just had to check it on Wikipedia. It is an opium-induced story, poem, that is very dreamy. Not, oh, he's so dreamy, but dreamlike. And very interesting. One second. I had that list up here and I lost it. Hold on a second. Speculative poetry. That's one. Is it horror? No, not really. There is some notes. The second stanza has this really cool thing about a woman wailing for a demon lover that I really like. It's a really great image. And apparently, when he wrote it, he sobered up a little bit and then couldn't keep his train of the poem. So it ends abruptly. I just looked on that when I looked it up. Apparently, Lord Byron is the one who convinced them to publish it. And we're very thankful that he did, because it is a fantastic poem. That one only takes you 3 minutes to listen to or read. I recommend it. Horror? No. Weird stuff, as in people who like weird horror stuff will like Kubla Khan? Yeah, definitely. Weird in the Lovecraftian 30s pulp sort of way. Who was next on my list? I lost it. Oh, Edgar Allan Poe. That's easy enough. Was that 3 for Coleridge? Yes, it was. Okay, so Poe. Of course, in short story writers, the king of the short story, also one of the fathers of speculative poetry. The father of short story is what Lovecraft called him. His poetry, not what I would call horrific, not what I would call, with the exception of a few, not what I would really call narrative. The closest that I found to horror, Silence a Sonnet, definitely on the verge of being horror, and then The Haunted Palace, also on the verge, but I wouldn't call it horror. There's more atmospheric, very close to horror, maybe horror-ish is what I wrote next to it. There's good ones like Sleeper or Conqueror Worms, Spirits of the Dead, also atmospheric. The Raven's also going to be atmospheric. A lot of them are a guy sitting alone in a room, mourning a dead woman. Annabelle, the Raven, yada yada yada. There's a bunch. Atmospheric and dreary, but horror dreary does not equal horror. Dreary is oftentimes just depressing or macabre. Well, no, hold on, I wouldn't even call it macabre. But atmospheric is what I have next to most of these. Silence a Sonnet, I would call ish. The Haunted Palace, I would call ish. Horror-ish. But I couldn't call him Poe as the example of horror poetry. He's not. Not compared to Goethe, not compared to Lovecraft, not compared to Fitzjames O'Brien, not compared to Coleridge, and not even compared to the next one on the list, Robert Browning. Robert Browning, E.A. Poe, I've given you his dates before, of course, 1809 to 1849, very young life, very short life. Robert Browning was next, 1812 to 1889. Very famous poet, not often in the horror field. His horror story, or his horror poem, is Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came, which was 1885, which is really why I put him there. Not 1885. 1865? Childe Roland. Let's get that. 1855. That's why I put it in that. That's why I put him in between Fitzjames O'Brien and Poe. Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came. It's not my favorite poet. It's not my favorite poem. I did look it up and listen to it again today. It's kind of long. It takes about 10 minutes to listen to. But, there are, I think it was line 125 when I looked it up online when I was looking along with it. That stanza was like, I'm scared of stepping on a dead man's face when I'm walking through a swamp. I'm putting my spear into the mud to keep whatever, and I might have speared a rat, but it sounded like a baby crying. That sort of stuff is creepy, and that fits. Childe Roland, of course, is Stephen King's basis for the Dark Tower series. He owns up to that. What was I going for that? What sentence was I going for there? Doesn't admit to it. He acknowledges that one of the main inspirations for the Dark Tower series, which is his serial book series that's not exactly horror, but certainly it's Stephen King, so it's going to border on some of these things that horror fans like. I didn't actually like the series. I only got to book 3 and I gave up halfway through book 3. I talked to someone else and they gave up in pretty much the same spot I did. But 1 was good. 2 was okay. But it was based on Childe Roland by Browning. But moving on, as I said, it's worth a listen to. I would definitely check it out, and that line 125 area. So Fitzjames O'Brien, we talked about him briefly. There he is. When I was going over Lovecraft liked him quite a bit. I like him quite a bit. He scares me. His most famous one is Demon of the Gibbet, and it is really scary. It is essentially a clone of Goethe's The Erlkönig. Instead of a son and father riding a cart back through the woods, it's a young man and his fiancée or wife or whatever riding on their horses past a gibbet, a place where people are hanged, and a demon pops out from the noose and terrorizes them with the same sort of result. Definitely recommend this one. Fitzjames O'Brien, we lost too soon. He died in the Civil War. He lived in Ireland for a while. He was an Irish, and then he immigrated to America, and then fought in the American Civil War, and got killed. But a very good writer, a very good poet, and like Lovecraft, I'd certainly recommend him highly. Yeah. So, and then we come to the man himself, Lovecraft. For the list, of course, of the people that I originally meant to talk about. Oh, Fitzjames O'Brien, 1828 to 1862. Again, very young life, but cut short by the Civil War. Howard Phillips Lovecraft. Very, people don't realize how much he wrote. He wrote, like graphomaniacally. Graphomaniacally? Is that the right word? He wrote a lot of stuff. And a lot of it was poetry. I mentioned before, when I was talking about Lovecraft, that some of his poetry is disturbing. If you do the Wikipedia bibliography on Lovecraft, I can talk today, you'll find some titles in there that are kind of offensive, because Lovecraft was known, and is known to be a big racist. Bigot, even, because, even though he married a Jewish lady, he, and then, divorced her, she made a point of saying in an interview, yeah, he'd say bad stuff against Jews, and she had to remind him, I'm a Jew. And of course, he wasn't too fond of black people, and had a particular epithet in one of his poems, which was kind of disgusting. No kind of about it. It was disgusting. But we're not talking about those kind of poems. We're going to try to talk about the ones that have to do with horror. So the horror ones, the biggest one, literally the biggest one, because it's also the longest one, the fungi of Yuggoth. It's fungus, plural fungus. Fungi. I never know how to pronounce that word. There's like 7 different pronunciations. They all sound weird to me. The fungi of Yuggoth. Yuggoth, of course, being a Lovecraftian mythos term. It's definitely mythos-esque. A lot of these are going to be mythos-esque, and this is the only one that really fits as a poem. There's a lot of poetic stuff. Most of Lovecraft's stuff is very poetic. The thing in poetry about diction, word choice. Lovecraft chose his words excellently. He is just spectacular at that sort of thing. He chooses his words perfectly in his short stories, or in his short stories that aren't short either, or his poems. His diction is fantastic. It's definitely horror-esque. It's definitely in the mythos area of things. And it's definitely long. I listened to it. It took about 45 minutes to listen to it. I found it on YouTube. Had a very good reader. I can't remember who it was, though. Maybe I'll put a link in the box. I recommend it highly. It is, of course, the text of it is available online as well. Otherwise, there is Azathoth. It's poetic, but not a poem. Nyarlathotep is Nyarlathotep. It's so difficult to pronounce. Is usually mixed in with poetry, but it's not a poem unless it's one of those prose poems, which it's poetic, but it's not poetry. Azathoth is also poetic, but not poetry. Nathakara was a good one. Nathakara was This is definitely Poe inspired in the it's Poe meets Lovecraft in a very cool way. It's the Poe sort of a guy is mourning a girl, but it's in a garden of Lovecraftian design where you're not sure if the guy and the girl were human to begin with. Which is, of course, is Poe-esque too in a Ligeia sort of way. Poe's story of Ligeia. So that's the ones that I have for that I originally wanted to talk about. And then I went online and I found the Speculative Poetry Wikipedia site. And it mentioned Clark Ashton Smith, which of course was a buddy of Lovecraft and a buddy of Robert E. Howard. Oh shoot, Robert E. Howard has poems too. I'm almost positive, and I think some of them were in the horror book that I had. But I only borrowed that book, so I don't have it with me. Robert E. Howard, I'm sure, I'm 80% positive that he had horror poetry. And I recommend anything by Robert E. Howard as well. Also, you got to watch out for the racism stuff in Howard, Robert E. Howard, but it's easy enough to bypass. Clark Ashton Smith was his buddy, and Clark Ashton Smith went through 3 major phases. He was a poet to begin with. Then he started writing short stories in the Lovecraft sort of vein, very much influenced by Lovecraft. And then his parents, it was like 2 years or 3 years, whereas Robert E. Howard died, his parents died, another one of his parents died, and then Lovecraft died. So his 2 main writer buddies and his parents died at the same time, and he couldn't write anymore. So he went to painting and sculpture. And I was thinking about including him in my painting and sculpture section, but it didn't really strike me as the right sort of thing. Oh, H.R. Geiger died today. So hopefully I gotta remember when I upload the painting ones to mention that. I think because I mentioned, oh, H.R. Geiger's still alive. No, unfortunately he died today at age 74. Poetry. I'm going back to poetry. So the speculative poetry, there's a speculative poetry award named after for the Clark Ashton Smith Award. I got to check out some Clark Ashton Smith poetry. That's basically what I haven't, but I should. I can recommend it sight unseen, I suppose, which I will. Or I'll do a little box. Yeah, check out these ones. I'll do that now when I upload it. And the other one I wanted to talk about was Christina Rossetti's, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, 1862 Goblin Market, one of the ones that was pointed out in the speculative poetry section. I listened to it not too long ago, and it's very good. I highly recommend it. It's on LibriVox as well. Oh, goodness. So, it's about two sisters. One of them eats goblin fruit and gets very sick. Months later, she's on the verge of death, and the other sister goes out and tries to buy some goblin fruit, and it doesn't work, and horror ensues, and I'm not going to spoil the ending, but it's definitely worth listening to. It's on LibriVox. It's kind of long. It'll take you about 20 minutes. Oh, I don't even know how long it takes. It's been months since I've listened to it, and I don't know how long the track list was, so I'm not going to speculate on that one. But it's worth it. Definitely a good story. A good poem. Again, it's narrative. These are narrative poems for the most part, with the exception of some Poe stuff. The Haunted Palace was more of trying to get the emotions out it's more of a lyrical poem. Silence Sonnet is certainly a lyrical poem. But most of these guys are, well, and then Coleridge's Kubla Khan could be considered a lyrical poem as well. Sort of. But it also tells a very strange, trippy story, because he was literally tripping when he wrote it, or on opium. Right, so I think that's it for horror poetry. I'm missing stuff because speculative poetry I didn't think of. Neil Gaiman, Robert Howard, Clark Ashton Smith, Christina Rossetti, and there's a list of them. I'll see if I can put a link on there for the list of speculative poets. Sight unseen, you may want to check it out. I might do a part 2 of this. I don't know. Anyway, but for now, folks, I'm going to call it a night. Call it a video. And we'll continue with horror music next time on Horror Analysis with me, Drew. Have a good night.